I'm Andy Schmuckler. This is the fifth in a series about some inevitabilities that I propose. One, starting with the evolution of life, that it's highly probable to the point where I feel like it's virtually inevitable that life has begun on a variety of planets. That wherever life, which is evolving according to sort of the Darwinian patterns of diversity and a selective process among the diverse and the shaping of genomes that can get into the future. It is inevitable that wholly opportunistic process will have part of the system of life on whatever planet developing intelligence as a strategy for survival. It's opportunistic. The niches are always seem to get filled wherever we look at parallel evolution around the world. So maybe it's only probable, but it looks kind of inevitable to me. And then over time, given enough time, I see no reason why the intelligence that's getting selected for wouldn't continue to rise. You get to the point where, with like our ancestors, you've got enough creative intelligence that you could say that the creature's strategy for survival is not just being bright, like you might say chimpanzees are, but actually investing more and more in becoming cultural animals, which are the culture being that which is created by the creative intelligence and passed along with in a way that, there are other creatures that have some culture, excuse me, but the magnitude of their culture, how much variety that produces in chimpanzee life, say, is so limited compared to us humans who biologically are language learners, but in terms of the development of languages themselves, we have created a huge variety. So I think it's inevitable that you will get to a cultural creature. Also, I've argued that it is the nature of culture that it rewards intelligence too, so that the creativity that made us tool users and the creativity that made us language users, all those things are reinforcing and actually affect our biology. So it is inevitable that culture will become a cumulative thing. And as time goes on, it will continue to develop in that direction as the rewards continue to expand the brain. We tripled over the last, I forget how long. It goes back a ways when our ancestors had brains 1/3 the size of ours, but it's a fairly finite period of time. And then the place where I feel, in a sense, the least confidence about the inevitability claim is I'm claiming that maybe it's inevitable that if you've got a cultural species with that kind of reinforcement of capacity, the ever greater capacity for culture, combined with how culture is cumulative, you'll eventually reach the point where people, these creatures, would have an incentive to invent a very different way of life in order not to have to face certain kinds of constrictions that every other species faces in terms of the balance of an ecosystem. So there's an incentive for making the breakthrough onto the path of civilization, whether it be gardening, herding, agriculture, and on and on and on. That the breakthrough into civilization, I think with humans, it came because of a food crisis in prehistory, which is the name of a book by a guy at Yale, I think it was, named Cohen. Not sure what the status of that book is now. I did research for that book, which was published in 1984, back before I wrote that book. And though I keep in touch with the field, I don't really continue to investigate everything. Partly I've been so preoccupied for the last 20 years about protecting this country from the rising force of fascism, which is part of the same picture, but that is another story. So it is said by some anthropologists that no hunting-gathering people ever went in the direction of agriculture as to a better option. It was pretty much necessity that grows out of the success of a cultural animal, I think. But maybe it's not the case that maybe you could go on with hunting-gathering people living cultural lives, but continuous with our primate past. I tend to think that ultimately the point would be reached where, if not by necessity, then at least by somebody getting some bright ideas that accumulate, and suddenly you've started inventing a wholly different way of life, whether that was necessary or not. I think necessity played a role, but I don't really know. But then there comes the one thing that I think is, I've been working with this idea for 54 years. I've examined it I don't know how many times. I can't find any holes in it. It really looks to me like it's inevitable that if a creature steps onto the path of civilization, it is inevitable that it will its civilization will evolve in directions that are in many ways contrary to the needs of the creature, ways it wouldn't have chosen, but that are necessary because stepping onto that path unleashes a destructive force. And I tried to show how that destructive force inevitably arises, such that the ways of power will inevitably move through the system, inevitably be destructive in various ways, which also lead to other destruction, as I'll talk about in the next video. Inevitably, the ways of power spread throughout the whole system because power acts as a contaminant. And the inventions and innovations in political structure and in economic system and in technology and in the psychological structure of its members, all those play a role in determining will this society have what it takes to prevail in a war of all against all. And that arises because the step onto the path of civilization, inventing your own way of life, extricating yourself from the niche in which you evolved biologically, all of that means that you are leaving an ordered world and plunging, even if you couldn't see it coming, into a kind of disorder that generates a destructive force. I think that's inevitable. This video is about just articulating a challenge that civilization creating species inevitably must meet. And it's a combination of what I just said about there's a destructive force that civilization inevitably emerges into a disordered situation. And that disorder inevitably gives a destructive force, a disproportionate say. I call it the spirit of the gangster. But at the same time, the civilization creating species is accumulating culture, making ever greater progress in dealing with the challenges that they face, which include how to survive in a war of all against all, which include how to maximize their power, for example, not only feeding their people, but the Industrial Revolution made Europe very more powerful, able to imprint much of its cultural development on the rest of the planet through their imperialism. The things that they did technologically and politically and otherwise, the economic systems, they were able to dominate because they had the power. And the power of a society in the anarchic system of interacting intersocietal system, civilized societies having to deal with each other outside of any order, that results in a selective process, which is due to the system's dynamics. The war of all against all means that only the ways of power can spread. So that combines with the fact, or that I said was an inevitability, that eventually, since culture is cumulative, and since the cumulative nature of things is such that the society, the civilization, is inevitably going to become more and more powerful. So that the British Empire is way more powerful if it had to go up against the Roman Empire of 2000 or 1800, whatever, years before. There can be ups and downs, like the Roman Empire can fall apart and civilization can become diminished. But eventually, in Europe, the societies that emerged out of the war of all against all into the future, and then into the rise of science and the industrial revolution, eventually the power of European civilization, to name one, and offshoots like the United States, and is greater than anything. So the long-term tendency of a civilization, if it survives, is going to be ever escalating levels of power. And that means that eventually, I argued in the previous, eventually this civilization will be powerful enough to be able to destroy itself. And if you combine the fact, my assertion that a civilization will eventually have that much power, if you add to that there is out of that disorder that takes apparently for a long, long time to bring under control, you combine that destructive force that emerges out of that disorder with that civilization making creature's ability to destroy itself, there you have the challenge that a civilization making species inevitably must confront. Namely, to get its civilization, which inevitably emerged disorderly, well enough ordered to prevent its destroying itself, which in our case has got to do with nuclear holocaust and climate change and things like that. I don't know that I can envision, if we have a lot of other planets where civilization, some creature has stepped onto the path of civilization, and whether when they ended up looking at this possibility they might destroy themselves. I don't know if it was like going to be nuclear and climate change, or if there's going to be some other form. But if it gets more and more powerful with time, eventually the level of the power is going to cross the line of powerful enough to destroy itself. And you add to that the destructive force that emerged with civilization has to get brought under control, or that destructive force can see to that the powers that are big enough to destroy itself are utilized in destructive ways. So the challenge that every civilization faces, I think inevitably, is to order its civilization well enough soon enough to prevent the nuclear holocaust kind of war destruction, and to prevent the creature from having an economic, technological system that's so destructive of the flows of the biosphere, including the climate, that it destroys itself. So we need how this leads in a way to the two questions I think that are worth articulating about the solution to the problem that we inevitably faces a civilization creating species. I would be very interested to know how many of our fellow civilized species scattered around the cosmos get this taken care of more readily than we have. I'm not real impressed with what we've been able to do, but we're still in the game for now, and maybe we're going to make it. Maybe there are other outfits that for whom they never had to confront, but I don't expect so. I think I'm going to think that we humans are smart enough and basically decent enough and wise and prudent enough that if it was easy, we would have done it. And I don't think it would be easier for any other creature. So I'm just going to imagine that we're sort of par for the course, that here we are, and maybe it's a toss-up whether we make it or not. And, I think it's going to be determined within the next not so many generations. It'll be one or the other, because once you get that kind of power, like in my lifetime, I'm at the beginning of the atomic age, but I wasn't born when they blew up the bomb on Trinity. I was a year off, but maybe we're going to make it. But I'm not as impressed as I would like. After World War II, there are a lot of dreams about how you could sort of defeat this war system that's been so destructive in so many ways for so long. FDR had this dream about the United Nations. Woodrow Wilson in World War I had this dream about the League of Nations. But neither one of them has been a solution. We still might blow ourselves up like we almost did in 1962. And the environmental awareness is really much more recent and still has been not impressive in how much what we need to do as a responsible civilization has triumphed over the brokenness that grows out of the destructive force. One form of which is like it gives you an industry that's willing to kill for money. It's one of those instances where human beings in general, as individuals, are not nearly as broken as a lot of the systems that we create that exert great power, including the fossil fuel industry. And we see that every time an industry has the choice between doing the responsible thing and dealing with how their product, what's making them rich, is killing people, they all show that they're willing to kill for money, and that's a systemic problem. And so is the war system. When you've got nothing to stop somebody like Putin from doing what he did, shattering so much that it took Europeans 70 years to build, or is it, since World War II, almost 80 years to build. There is a way in which the destructive force gets a disproportionate say on how things evolve, and that has to be ended. So a creature's challenge is to ask itself, what would our civilization look like where the possibility that would destroy ourselves, either in war or in environmental catastrophe, has been minimized? I'd like to say eliminated, but I think that's probably unrealistic. But if it's been minimized, what would that look like? The best possible ordering of the world. Given that we've stepped across, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. We can't go back, as Kamala says. we got to move forward into a better ordered civilization. Don't know if we're going to make it. But that's the challenge. And we should envision, what would that look like if we succeeded in ordering our civilization so that we've minimized the chance of self-destruction? What would that order look like? And then the second question, not that the first one's easy to answer, but we could be having conversations about that much more than we do. The second question is, well, what steps can we take now that are wisest and most prudent and most likely to help us get to that destination before we blow it? Those two questions aren't answers. I don't know how to get from here to there. But we need to be asking that question. That is the challenge that we face. To meet the challenge of ordering our civilization, that's, I think, the way to proceed. Focus on where we need to get to, and then find the steps that'll take us there. The last video, I think, will be coming up, which is that it is inevitable that if a creature steps onto the path of civilization, it has generated a dynamic, inevitably, in which there are two coherent forces battling each other over which is going to govern that creature's world in the civilized state. And if you look at the way those forces operate in the world and interact with each other, it has a lot of resemblance to the traditional understanding of it's a battle between good and evil. And I want to talk about that, and that it is inevitable that something that's reasonable, I mean, it can be described in other terms, which I will, as coherent forces, but also it is reasonable to say, you might as well talk about this as a battle between good and evil, because we're talking about one force that continually makes the human world worse and more broken, and another force which is continually working to make the human world better and more whole. And that it's going to be the battle between those two forces that look a lot like good and evil is going to be central to the drama of that creature as it steps onto the path of civilization and heads into the future, where either it gets its act together or it destroys itself. I like to imagine a cosmic social scientist or a historian who studies all the cultures that have played out, the civilized cultures that have played out in the cosmos, and it has enough so that it's able to divide into two groups: the ones that blew it and the ones that made it, that got their act together, and that did survive for the long haul rather than blowing themselves up or otherwise killing themselves off. And as a good social scientist, he's going to ask himself or herself, what differentiates these two groups, the societies that made it and the societies that blew it? And of course, this is all hypothetical, but what I imagine is that they will find that the creatures who recognized the challenge soonest and addressed it soonest did better than the ones that did it later. And I'm also going to suggest that the ones that basically understood what they were up against, understood that becoming the civilization creating creature was really a mixed bag. It sort of opened up a Pandora's box or something, however you want to put it. It condemned a creature to be in a rather difficult position where, on the one hand, it gets the capacity to do a lot of stuff that it wants to do because it's so smart and can invent a lot of stuff. But on the other hand, it's plunged itself into a social evolutionary process in which the spirit of the gangster gets way too much say about how things are going to evolve. So that's the human story as I understand it. And I'm guessing that it's inevitable that where life develops, unless something snuffs it out, like a planetary catastrophe, that it'll keep on going. And there are other folks out there in the past. I mean, it's 13.8 billion years since the beginnings of the Big Bang and such. There are other places out there that have gone through this, are going through it now, will in the future, whatever all this means when you're 13.8 billion light years away from some stuff. There is a population out there that are having to deal with this. On this planet, we know there is at least one species that having to confront that challenge, which I say was inevitable. And that battle between good and evil is actually, once in a while, really the way to see what's going on in the world around us, which is why I've spent the last 20 years working full time to raise the alarm that a force of fascism is arising in the United States of America and would damage most of what we regard as good, and would, I think, be a serious blow if we went fascist to humankind's prospects in general of getting our act together in the war system and the ecosystem to survive for the long haul. So our battle of today is one of the manifestations of our not having yet brought the destructive force under sufficient control, and of that our mission must be with this presidential election, with the war in Ukraine, for example, just to name two. Our task is to find ways of ordering our civilizations so that the destructive force is not able to control our destiny. The battle between good and evil that inevitably emerges with civilization is a good way to understand what we're up against right now in America. Thank you. Like, subscribe, and if you want to see any of these points systematically developed, I'm improvisational here, but systematically is my writing. And on my website, abetterhumanstory.org, you can find all this stuff and a fair amount more. Thank you.